1, 2, 3.
The following is a Laura Flanders Show audio exclusive.
Searching for a place where the people who say it can't be done take a backseat to the people who are doing it looked to the U.S. South, says today's guest, historian and author Imani Perry. Look to the South, to the suffering, theft, and greed wrapped up in colonialization, plantation slavery, and the models of addictive global capitalism that have brought us everything from cotton to Coca-Cola. Look to the guilt, repression, and denial, for sure, all of that stuff that U.S. culture pretends is just a Southern thing. But look too, she says, to the real, complex, intimate, rebellious, mixed up, intensely creative South that has led most of the revolutions in this divided nation and brought along a whole lot of the best food, drink, dance, and music. In her latest book, South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of a Nation, Imani Perry takes us on a travelogue. She's the author most recently before this book of Looking for Lorraine, the radiant and radical life of Lorraine Hansberry, who brought us Raisin in the Sun, among other things. I welcome her to the program. Imani, welcome to the Laura Flanders Show. Radiant and radical seems to be your thing. Is that what attracted you to the South?
Oh, well, I mean, yes, and attracted Lorraine to the South as well. And thank you so much for having me. Yeah, she was deeply inspired. You know, she had a short life, unfortunately, but at the end of her life, she was deeply inspired and moved and attempted to be involved in as much as she could while battling cancer in the Southern movement. And so it's a sort of, an organic trajectory, as it were.
You are from the South. Talk a little bit about your own personal origins and why you went back there right now for this book.
Yeah, thank you. So, actually, your introduction was just so beautiful and apt because the story of the South is more complex and more politically rich than what it's given credit for. I was born into, on the one hand, a kind of traditional striving working class Black family, but also had parents who were radicals and involved in the late era of the freedom movement, prison organizing, organizing workers in steel mills and coal mines and the like. And so and there is this incredibly beautiful radical tradition in Alabama and amongst Black Alabamans in particular. So there is both a way in which I was organically rooted in what the South was historically and its people, and also in a submerged political tradition that made explicit connections to the globe. So it was quite, I guess, sort of natural to turn to the South in this moment. People keep talking about how we're in the midst of culture wars of various sorts, as though there's something new. And in point of fact, these are essential fundamental tensions that have existed since the beginning, since the European encounter with the South, driven by desire, imagination, and greed, and a willingness to exploit and push people out and suck the lives out of people who were brought in. And so we're in this a kind of cyclical relationship between land and the people and power. And I wanted to tell a story that I thought would illuminate how that is.
I'm from the South, but from the south of England, or at least the British side of my family come from the London area. The American side of my family, my grandmother, my mother actually came from Iowa. But I've heard you interviewed by white hosts as this book has come out who have been quick to say they are from the South. And I just wondered whether you cringe a little at that, because there are so many Souths. At the same time, there is this intimacy that you describe, a word that comes up a lot in your book.
Yeah. I mean, part of it is, there's this incredible intimacy, particularly across the color line that is distinct in US history. And also a very delicate détente, tension that exists. And that sort of dynamic is, I think, so frequently misunderstood because people overread what legal segregation was, right? It's about stratification, not actually about keeping people apart. There's a deep, so intimate connections in the domestic sphere, for example, even if public facilities were not. I don't cringe. I do. I mean, I think what's interesting is to have the conversation and actually sit in what is when are moments of discomfort, which is part of what I try to do in the book. I have all of these encounters. You have an encounter with a white woman whose husband left her. She was a Lyft driver and she became a faith healer and she was sneaking into hospitals. I have an encounter with a man who was refilling the candy machine at the airport. And so these interactions with white Southerners and trying to make sense of them, often we're speaking the same language, but I'm also trying to think about what does it mean? There's some things we can talk about and some things we can't, and things that are very easy to do, like hold someone's hand and pray, but there's territory that is delicate, right? And that, that's part of the work of what the book is trying to get to.
The territory is delicate and also has been invaluable to this country. You're right. Fill coffers, steal lives. You're right, that American exceptionalism, that sense that we are somehow special and ordained as such, is a myth sedimented on Southern prosperity, oil, coal, and cotton. And even if you choose to wrap all of that sort of history in a kind of romantic nostalgia, you say integrity requires that the stories be halfway honest.
Yes.
Talk about that.
Absolutely. Because, so for example, when I think about the history of mining, this incredible history of protest, of organizing, right, of union organizing that coexisted, right, with a white supremacist social order, such that groups of people who are both being subject to exploitation, who are both having literally their lives sucked out, air sucked out of their lungs, are encouraged to dissociate from each other, right, in the service of this myth, right? It's so some of these encounters are me trying. One of the things that I say is I feel much I have more care and sensitivity to the quote unquote hillbillies than the one who wrote their elegy, right? To think about what it means, what the deep sort of structure hierarchy in a society means. And we could see it more recently with the way Joe Manchin sort of disregards caring for his constituency, right? I mean, so these are the kinds of sort of encounters that I want to sort of disentangled in order to have us think in a more honest way about the regimes of power that exist there, and also who's served, who's disserved by them.
I mean, I don't want to keep coming back to me, but in the UK, we have a kind of north-south divide too, and a similar relationship to the north as exists here in the south, in the sense that this sense of the very part of the country that has been the driver of economic conquest, success, if you want to call it that, wealth for sure, is the part we choose to disdain and distance ourselves from. Overlaid with race in this country in a unique and deadly way. How do we get out of that? And how can you help us think about that beyond just this kind of guilt and, brushing it under the carpet?
Well, for me, I mean, I'll admit, I if I knew how we could get out of it, I would be doing a different kind of work probably. But I do think that there's a necessary move, which is to be honest about, kind of reject the narrative, right? So the standard narrative is, the ever more perfect union, the mythos of the nation. And then the South is this sort of embarrassing, backwards, different, strange kind of place. It is the repository for all of the nation's sins. You see it every time something bad happens politically, right? Can't they just secede? Can't we just get rid of them? When of course, the ways of the South are precisely what allowed this nation to become a global power. It's prosperity, right? So it's not as though that is the shame of the South, that is the shame of the nation, right? And so to be, so to the extent that I'm, so a condition for actually addressing these ways is to be honest about who benefits from them. They're not, you know, the way people talk about the South, you wouldn't necessarily understand how incredibly powerful it has been in US history, right? But the Revolutionary War debt paid by the South. DC is where it is because of Southern power. Global wealth because of mass number, all of this unfree labor and the power of cotton. You can go on, on and on and on. So it's a powerful region, right? And it's an influential region. And we live with this mythology so that we don't have to deal with all of what the nation is, right? And why those ways can be powerful because it benefits the nation. So to me, the necessary but insufficient step is to talk about that, right? And then of course, how many generations of people have said some version of this, but to understand, the structure of haves and have-nots in a more sophisticated way, and not to be moved about by the political whims of elites so easily as, of course,
You're right, and of course it's true that a lot of people talk about backwardness in relation to the South. But when you talk to Southern organizers, they'll say, as goes the South, so goes the nation. The South is often the cutting edge of things, whether it's plantation economics or extraction or civil rights.
Yes, oil, car culture, right? Certainly it's at the front lines now with the impending environmental disaster, right? And then that, being at the cutting edge of so much of the disasters, also why it is often at the cutting edge of social movement and organizing, right? Whether it's environmental justice issues now or whether it's prison issues. So one of the things that I talk about in the book is that my parents were involved in prison organizing in the 70s. And that, it seems like an early timeline, but of course the South, what was happening was a harbinger of what was going to happen all over the country. So it was there first, right? Decades before people started describing mass incarceration, it was very apparent that it was coming if you were in the South, right? And the prison being on the very plantations where people were once enslaved is an indication, right, of its heart, right?
In Mississippi, you mentioned that your parents, I think, knew or at least knew of Chokwe Lumumba, who went on for a bit to be mayor of Jackson. His son now carrying forward his vision to some extent, a vision of a new kind of approach to economics, sort of the opposite of the plantation economy. Can you talk about that and what else you may have seen on your travels that gave you a sense of, oh, this could be the future coming out of the South?
Right. Well, I do. There is this group, and they range from sort of liberal to leftist, right? But of young Black mayors who are trying to reimagine the economy of the South. I take one of the models for doing so to be Richard Arrington, who was the first Black mayor in Birmingham, Alabama, who was part of the mobilization for his election was a police killing of a Black teenager, right? In the 70s when I was a little girl. And so there, a teenage girl was killed. And so again, right, so we're thinking about these issues with Black Lives Matter, but that was an impetus for a really important political organizing of Black communities in Birmingham, in the 70s. And so it has a tradition. I think these new models, they're trying to imagine what does it mean to actually establish safety nets at the local level? What does it mean to actually resist at the local level? People talk about the South in terms of red states, which in and of itself is a kind of strange formulation because it depends on the electoral college formula, right? When the whole country is actually purple, right? But the red state, blue state thing. So you actually don't get to see that kind of local work that's happening easily unless you're in the South. And there's a tradition there, I describe Chokwe Lumumba, I describe him as a scion of sorts, right? And I tell a story about being in Cuba with a radical who was in exile, who had been part of the New African Peoples Organization, and how we talked about his election as a victory. And that's also important, right? That there's a tradition of radical politics that sees electoral politics as important, not to the exclusion of other kinds of organizing, but integral to a larger project of imagining liberation.
And sees that black belt with its huge density of black voters and black people as a rich, a fertile soil for the kind of change that you're talking about.
Yes, and I think it's important to keep in mind, notwithstanding Mississippi's poverty and its, deeply problematic uh, uh, executive, that it has the most extensive Black political network anywhere in the country, and that comes directly out of the history of SNCC. And so, that there are still efforts to mobilize, and there's still a great deal of possibility there, and a lot in terms of instructing other regions about how to think about politics on the hyper local level where it really does matter.
The Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee, SNCC. We're talking with Imani Perry, author of South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of a Nation. And throughout the book, you have this kind of Zen-like balance of the problematic, the troubling, and the full of potential. And you mentioned Birmingham, and it's impossible not to think of Dr. King, particularly this time of year, and his letter from Birmingham jail that talked about urgency. The urgency of now, and that change isn't inevitable. We like to think of that arc tilting towards justice, but in that letter, he says there is such a thing as being too late. And the other thing that your storytelling does that's so beautiful is to remind us how history doesn't just go in one direction. Progress doesn't just go in one direction. And we've seen very flourishing, healthy Black economies just destroyed by white reaction. How do you make sense of that? And is that anything to do with how you chose to tell this story, which was not in a kind of linear...
Yeah, no, it's very, the non-linearity and also even the multiple meanings at the level of the sentence are really important to the story. Because, and I begin by talking about, the book begins by talking about set dances in Louisiana in the 19th century, and the variation between different types of European set dances, and the quadrille, which becomes a metaphor for various political parties vying for control over the lives of unfree people. So given that, I think that there is an essential tension, right? There's the mythos of the nation, imagination, aspiration, growth, and then that is always in the history of this country deeply connected to pushing people out, grinding them down, working them to death, right? Given that that has become a way of being that is so integral to the political culture, the economic culture of this nation, we necessarily wind up in a cyclical relationship to ideas of freedom, or justice or inclusion, because those ways slip back in over and over again. They are seen as norms. So for example, when we talk about gentrification, that's an old way, right? That starts with the relationship to the indigenous, right? When we talk about what it means to not make a living wage, that's an old way, right? When we talk about child removal, harkens all the way back to both slavery and the indigenous boarding schools. When we think of stories of the movement, and Birmingham is really important to me because it was an industrial city. And so organizing was, yes, about, segregation, but it was also about labor. It's about work, right? And so when I go now and talk about who's working in chicken plants now, right, or catfish farms, where historically it was Black people who were brought in because they were forced to work for a lower wage, and now it's people from Central America, but the relation is still the same, right? These sort of ideas that people who don't count can just be brought in, and worked and vulnerable, right? Politically vulnerable to policing and the like. These are habits, They're habits, they're assumptions about acceptable ways of dealing with human beings.
Now, that makes me think of something else that you write. You write that Black people in the South have a steeliness learnt of what they've been up against, and of the realization that they have no option but to fight, that there's no other place that's going to save us. And it reminds me of a conversation we had on this show not so long ago about the border and the U.S. mythology of always having somewhere else to go. Go west, young man, all the rest of it, having a frontier you can go beyond. We're at our limits geographically and environmentally. What are the lessons of the South, or a few that you want to lift up about the steeliness of staying where you are?
Yeah, I mean, it's funny. I mean, part of my thought about that steeliness is, of course, because I don't come from a great migration family in the sense of people in my family moved to the urban South, but my family is not a family that moved to Chicago or Detroit or what have you, or Philadelphia. And so the sort of sense of the staying and fighting part feels, almost sort of organic to me as a sensibility. But look, given at a certain register, it's like, irrespective of where you are physically, given the power of the United States globally, and part of what I write about in the book is the reach of the South into, politics with the Middle East and politics with Central America and the rest, that is actually really significant to understand. So whether you're actually physically there or elsewhere, right? If we care about the human condition, if we care about the earth we occupy, one has to sit in that space at a certain level, right? And sit in what it means to, for example, completely destroy the earth, right, in the service of industry, right? There's a couple of examples for me that were really potent. Is the way people talk about off the coast of North Carolina, the trees older than Jesus. Mm-hmm. And I love that because, North Carolina is the Bible Belt, right? And that there's almost a kind of tacit awareness. Something came before this ideology, right? Or the cypress trees in the Gulf Coast, right? That are thousands of years old. There's something that came before. And I think there's something meaningful about attending to the land that reminds you that something came before that is worthy of preserving, before these ideas that are treated as literally gospel. Right?
The land has those ideas worthy of preserving. Also, the blood and sweat soaked into it that is our legacy. Yes. You say history. What do you say is instructive? History is an instruction?
Yeah.
What's it teach?
It is. I mean, I think, I think of it as an instruction in contrast to myth, the romance. It's very easy to be particularly critical of the United States, but nationalisms, period, are often based in romances that evade the complexity of history and its ugliness, right? Unless it's fitting into a master narrative. And so to me, when I attend, if I would walk through landscapes and just try to be attentive, architecture, land, sites of various kinds of events. It's wild in many instances. I mean, I'm not disciplined in this, but it's a reminder. History, how we tell the story is always a choice. It's like, with map making, right? So Bonini's paradox says, if you put everything on a map isn't useful. Something's very similar about that with history, right? So you can't tell every detail, but the details you choose are reflective of values and priorities. And so for me, the question, so I want us to move through history with some humane values, right? With some decency, and be taught by that. Right? If we pay attention, who counted, who didn't, who lived, who died, who worked, who had leisure, all those kinds of questions, tell us something that is useful for being, honest with respect to the values we proclaim.
I've always thought those land recognition statements, while valuable and a helpful prompt, would take up a very long time if we really acknowledged all of the people who we need to acknowledge. Absolutely. Fed into this land at this moment. All the people that birthed people, all the people that worked here. we'd be here forever.
And you know what's so complicated about land acknowledgements is that they depend upon a notion of sovereignty, which not all indigenous people have recognized sovereignty, right? And sovereignty is even it's though it's important to recognize, the settler colonialist politic, sovereignty is a complicated concept, right? In a history where people are consistently exploited or excluded from even being contemplated as a member of any nation.
And it tries to fix things in place that were not always so fixed in place. It's a whole other story, but it leads me to, are you patriotic? What's your relationship to patriotism?
I am absolutely not patriotic. I think that all forms of nationalism should be treated skeptically, but I love the country. It has an element of sentimentalism. It also has an element of defiance, right? Claiming membership. This is my place. And sort of like the James Baldwin formulation, right? That means that I have the right to criticize it, right? I do not, I cannot stomach the thought that it is ethical to believe that members of one nation are more valuable than another. At best, the nation state can be an experiment. In many ways, thus far, it has been a failed experiment. But I think, we could try it. We could try it differently.
We can't end without talking about love, not of country, but of people. And there is a wonderful part of the book where you talk about Southern yearnings. Seen and not seen, spoken and unspoken. You say much of the South's conservatism is little more than an effort to zone where we place the yearnings that we don't know what to do with. Every time you see a pastor facing a scandal, remember that. Well, I do. And I appreciate that. Can you talk about it a little bit more? Because I think it also speaks to we have a lot of yearnings we don't know what to deal with, of all sorts, and we tend to just, as you say, zone them off someplace.
Right, and it's a way of stratifying people, right? So if we think about the South is home to such beautiful queer cultures, right? But it is also geographically, culturally, religiously hostile to queerness, right? Not because there's a thought that it does not exist, but it's supposed to be at the bottom, right? Queer people are supposed to be at the bottom. And it's similar, there are times when people speak romantically about interracial intimacy. And I have to remind people that has always been some part of living in the Deep South. When we talk about, for example, the Virginia opinion, right? Legalizing interracial marriage, the significance of it isn't that, now Black and white people would have children. That always happened, right? The significance is that it would be that the offspring would be seen as the legitimate children of white parents because they could not be. So same thing with much of evangelism. The Bible Belt has, you look at, one of the things I talk about is porn searches in the Bible Belt, right? That they reflect precisely what is ostensibly forbidden. And so for me, then the point is to not just be honest about yearnings, but also to reject the idea that people should be stratified in that way, right? Based upon desire, and of course, all a variety of identity categories. And it's just sort of effort. I want to get underneath the myth to actually look at human experience.
Well, it is a great book. And the other aspect of it, I mean, we've talked about labor and land and exploitation and yearnings. It's also full of music and food and dance, and reminds us that some of that yearning, some of that love speech expressed itself through dance and rebellion and an assertion of humanity. That has been obviously an inspiration to the U.S. culture as a whole. Talk a bit about this kind of some of the stories that we tell about music that came from the birthplace of rock and roll, the birthplace of the blues. And yet, as you point out, those birthplaces, the actual homes of some of the people, the Black people responsible are not well maintained.
Right. So this is one of the interesting, I compare, for example, Elvis Presley's childhood home and Aretha Franklin's. And while they were living in Memphis, both in Memphis, um, and while they were living, right, or young rather, before Aretha Franklin moved to Detroit, her house was bigger, right? It's a nicer house. At the time of her death, when people went to see it, it had fallen in a state of disrepair, whereas Elvis's home was maintained, his childhood home was maintained beautifully. And then there's Graceland. And the context of that is also to tell a story that's truer about Elvis, right? So there's a myth that Elvis was racist, and I say that actually Pat Boone deserves that reputation rather than Elvis, that Elvis was actually looked down upon because of his proximity to Black people, and that he acknowledged his apprenticeship to Black musicians. But that the issue is that he, as a white man who became known as the king of rock and roll, was valued more and continues to be valued more because of white supremacy. So there's a difference between his attitudes and the kind of political economy of music as a source of culture and pleasure. And so, but then I also asked the question, because he did acknowledge his apprenticeship to Black musicians, but what did he do? Do we know anything about? And I don't have any documentation, what he did in 1968, when this Black and white sanitation workers were clearly having very different kinds of experiences. They both groups were sanitation workers. Black men died on the job. Black men rode in the cab with the maggots and the worms, and that's what took King to Memphis, to the sanitation workers strike. And so it's a point about racialization, two groups of people both economically suffering, but race leading to different interpretations of their experiences and their value. And then the question being thrown back, is there possibility to be disentangled from the wages of whiteness, if we take an old Du Boisian term, for the white Southerner, which is always in some ways the question.
Well, we're at that point in the conversation where we need to move towards a close. And I think that you've left us with a beautiful distinction between personality and people and their attitudes and the power structures in which we live. Sometimes those structures seem almost impossible to shift. And we ask on this show, people have often said, I think since Arundhati Roy said that another world is possible. But where have you tasted or smelt or felt that it really wasn't just possible, but happening?
I mean, this is what there's two things I say. One is that as much as, yes, there are structural and institutional forces and economic forces at work, the social order is maintained by cumulative decisions that are made by people every day, right? So there is a possibility of putting a wrench in the works, as it were, right? With the possibility of transformation, with something being ignited. And for me, I just always say, I'm from Birmingham. If you're from Birmingham, you can't believe things could change. You might as well give up, sort of freedom is a possibility. The most violent, most racist city in the South, Birmingham, by the time I came of age, right, where I'm, 9, 10, 11, it had been transformed so dramatically to a place where there's Black political power, access. Of course, it still has numerous challenges in terms of economic inequality, but people, and not children, right, regular folks, transform the city. That's the kind of possibility that we can ride on.
Imani Perry's Get Thee to Birmingham, I think is the message. South to America, A Journey Below the Mason-Dixon to Understand the Soul of a Nation. It's out now from Echo Books, which is an imprint of HarperCollins. Thanks so much for joining us. It's really been a pleasure to have you.
Thank you so much for having me.